Welcome to The Writer's Routine, the creative person's podcast. My name is Dan Simpson, and now this is the show where we get tips and advice from some of the best authors around on how to come up with ideas, how to jot them down on paper to get them published, and most importantly, how to plan your day for maximum efficiency in mind. Today, we're chatting to one of this country's most successful thriller writers. It's probably not the most boastful way to start my own show, but I think this week I've subscribed to like 3 or 4 new podcasts about all sorts of stuff as well. Are you the same? When you see a show, when you're scanning through the podcast store and it's about something that you're interested in, you get really excited, you download it straight away, and then you think, how am I going to find the time to listen to this? So that was what I was doing. And I want to say thank you to you right now for finding the time to listen to The Writer's Routine. And I need your help to get other people to find us and listen in as well. This is the bit where I get a bit needy and naggy, you know, a bit like a worried mother chucking her scarf at her son in the middle of September before he leaves the house, because it looks a bit chilly and you won't feel the benefit if you don't have it. Yeah, I need to ask you, please leave us a review, some stars on the iTunes podcast store. That's the best way that people can find out about this show. It's not done on the amount of downloads, it's on surge of momentum, on velocity. So if you can find the energy to help us out, that would be great. Just leave us a review. Find Writer's Routine on the iTunes podcast store. Our guest on The Writer's Routine this week is Simon Toyne. He is the best-selling author of the Sanctus and now Solomon Creed series, and ever since he was young, he had a dream of telling stories. And he started working in TV as a producer, amongst other things, to help share those tales, but it wasn't enough. And as a sort of midlife crisis, it's fine, he said those words to me, it's okay. He packed up his life, his wife, his kids, and he took them all to France for half a year off with the dream of finally writing a thriller. Not just getting down a regular, romantic, whimsical notion of a book, though. He needed this to be successful because he wanted to make a career out of it. So he analysed how to get that done. We'll find out more about that in the chat. Let me very quickly mention today's weird and wonderful writer's routine is from Charles Dickens. Usually I have to give a little cryptic descriptive tease on the author for the middle of the show. Don't need that with Dickens, I think. We'll get his distinguished diary in a little bit. First, it's the author Simon Toyne with his writing routine.
I've got an office. And I kind of spend enormous amounts of time and energy avoiding going to it. I figure partly because I did spend, before I was a novelist, I worked in television, and so I had an office for a lot of time, or a specific workplace that you have no choice but to go to. And so now I do have a choice, you know. You've got a laptop, you can work anywhere. And I actually quite like the variety of going to various places. But in my office, if I am sat at my office, it's in the basement. I live in a flat in a big old building in Brighton, and weirdly, even though it's the first floor flat, we've got the basement as well. I don't know why, how it was cut, but anyway, so in the basement there's a little office, and what's really good about it is there's no internet down there. None. You know, I've even sort of with my phone wandered around trying to get a signal, and it's nothing. There's no. It's like deep in the chalk of Brighton, and so I don't get internet, which is really useful if you're trying to write something, because the internet is just endlessly distracting. And to the left slightly there's a speaker, to the right slightly there's another speaker and a stack of CDs. Because there's no internet, you see, down there, I can't even do the streaming of the Apple Music or the Spotify. So, like, I've had to go old school and either play stuff off my laptop or actually play CDs on a CD player, which is actually quite useful. I use them as timing devices because, you know, an album, a good old-fashioned album, it's around about 40, 45, 50 minutes, which is about the amount of time you can concentrate without your brain starting to kind of, you know, sort of sabotage you.
That's in the office, though. So where do you tend to write?
Well, I've been doing a lot of travelling this year, so I've been writing on trains and in planes and in waiting rooms and airports and various things, in transit and in waiting for things. Hotel rooms are quite good for writing because they're quite anonymous, and you just sort of sit there, and they generally have nothing to look at. I also used to, but slightly less now, write in a cafe around the corner from where I now live in Brighton. So about a year and a bit ago, we moved back to Brighton. I used to drop my eldest two off at the school, which is in Brighton, then sit in this cafe around the corner, Cafe Marmalade, which is acknowledged in Solomon Creed, and literally sit there all day until it was time to pick them up. So I'd have coffee there, and then I'd have mid-morning tea, then I'd have lunch, then I'd have afternoon tea, and then I'd go. And it got to the point where I would sit in a table, a nice spread-out table at the beginning of the day, and then as it got busier, I'd just feel more and more guilty, and so then I'd move to a smaller table, and then I'd end up perching on one of those little benches, sort of, where you're supposed to just, like, stand and wait for your coffee.
But if you're writing a series of books, which you have been doing so far, I guess then you're always writing to a deadline. Do you not then need to kind of break up your time so you know where you need to be in your story at what point of the year?
Yes, there's a very simple calculation you do. You get a contract which tells you when you need to deliver a book and how long it needs to be. And you look at the calendar and work out how many days between where you are now and where that deadline is. And you divide the number of words by days. And so initially you look at it and you go, I just need to write 150 words a day. That's easy. Then you'll sort of do research and, miss days and do some outlining. And so your word count doesn't go up. So then you'll do the calculation again, maybe a couple of months down the line. And then all of a sudden it's 600 words a day to hit deadline, and you go, okay, that's 2 pages, that's fine, I can do that. And then there hits a point where you realise you just need to kind of wake up and start writing and do thousands of words a day, and to get it. And I, most of the time I do get there, not always. It's a strange process, writing or anything creative, is you kind of, what you need to produce at the end, but the process by which you get there is not entirely under your control. Or you hit a point where you realise you really do need to research something in order to make the next bit work. Or the other thing that happens is, even if you've got an outline, which I tend to, you reach normally at the third, fourth. You've set everything up and developed everything, and it's not quite the end. So it's that little section that links the beginning to the end. It is baggy. There's problems with it, and you need to do something. And often the thing that you thought would work when you were outlining it in abstract months earlier just doesn't work anymore, because the characters have developed and things have happened and extra twists have happened. So often at that point you need to go back and rewrite something earlier on in order to open something up in that section that's going to make it work.
I think it's time for the
origin story.
This origin story is one of the most romantic origin stories you will find from any writer. Strap yourself in.
I know, it kind of sounds made up, but it's not. But okay, so I worked in television, as I said, and I'd always wanted to write something big. So when I was younger, I'd started off writing screenplays and trying to get them made and made short films. And because I was doing film stuff, I ended up having this career in television because I got paid for doing TV stuff. And so then this part-time job of doing bits of TV so that to fund the writing ended up as this 20-year career. So I was approaching my 40th birthday, which obviously is the traditional time of assessing where you are in life. And I realised it was never going to happen. The novel or the big story or whatever was never going to happen, because doing something full-on creative, there's nothing in the tank. So, to try and write a novel at the end of a day. I mean, I know the people who do things like lawyers, for example, often write books and become novelists by writing 2 or 3 books in their spare time, or they'll go to chambers and an hour ahead of when they're supposed to be there, and they'll write something. But I always feel with that, there's this massive pent-up creative energy that's not being released. Because their job is in no way creative. Well, it's kind of creative, but in a very narrow way, and the language they use is when you're writing a book, you're often deliberately choosing ambiguous language to describe things, partly because that's how we talk, and also because you want to be disguising something, so it could go one or two ways. If you're writing a legal thing, it's got to be absolutely, there's no ambiguity. It's kind of, this word means this, and this phrase means this. So it's a totally different thing. So I can totally see how you'd want to write a book to free yourself. But if I was doing creative stuff where all of that was coming into play anyway, and producing big series and being in late night edits and being on location, there was no real energy left. So I figured if I was ever going to do it, I needed to do it honestly, and if it failed, fail honestly. So I quit my job. I said I thought I could give myself 6 months to try and write something. I said to my wife, why don't we go on an adventure, on a little family adventure? So we saved up for a bit, and then we rented our flat out in Brighton, and rented a house in the south of France, in the Tarn. So that was the plan, but also to make the money last, because the rental of the flat in Brighton was funding it partly. We went in the depths of winter, where no one wants to go to the south of France, and we've realised why people don't want to go to the depths, because it's really cold. And I had 2 or 3 ideas of books I was going to write. I'd sort of been noodling around with some things, and I thought 6 months I knew I could write, because working in TV, I'd been creative to order. So we set off to our house in France on the 1st of December 2007, I think. The plan was go on the midnight ferry from Newhaven to Dieppe, and then drive down the 8 or 9 hours to the house, make it all nice, and then a day later they all fly out. But it's December the 1st in the Channel, and so there's a massive gale blows up, and we didn't sleep at all. But when we arrived in Dieppe, just glad that we weren't dead. And as we were driving in, about 40 minutes inland from Newhaven is Rouen. From Dieppe is Rouen, and as we pulled in, I saw the spire of Rouen Cathedral, which is this very kind of needly, sort of strange tower of a thing, and a quote that I listened to ages ago or I'd read somewhere and really liked, came into my head, which is "A man is a god in ruins," the Ralph Waldo Emerson quote. And there was something about that and the play on words of Rouen and ruin that just lodged in my head. And then so we slept for a few hours, and I got back in the van and we drove, and about 10 minutes outside of Rouen, the radio broke. So for 8-9 hour drive, all I had in my head to entertain myself was the scenery, and this image of the spire of Rouen Cathedral and this quote going around in my head. And by the end of that journey, I had the end of what turned out to be Sanctus. So at the end of that 6 months, I'd written about 140 pages, and we went back to England broke, and I got a job back at the TV company that I'd resigned from, on a much lower level and much lower pay, but I'd had the start of the book, and so over the next year I finished it, and then that's the book that became Sanctus, and I got a deal, and it's been translated into 29 languages, and was the biggest best-selling debut thriller of 2011. So it all worked.
We'll have part 2 of our chat with Simon Toyne in just a sec, where we'll talk about how he analysed other novels to figure out what sold so he could make an actual career out of being a thriller writer. Stay right there. Next, we've got our Distinguished Diary with Charles Dickens. Time for Distinguished Diaries then, where we look at a weird and wonderful writing routine from someone huge in history. Today, it's Charles Dickens. Now, we know about Charles Dickens, obviously. Great Expectations, A Christmas Carol, Oliver Twist. So this isn't news, but it is a real point to make of just how prolific he was as a simple writer of words. Of the 15 novels that he wrote, 10 were longer than 800 pages. And to get all those words down, he needed specific things in place, right? One of those was absolute quiet. In one of the houses that he wrote, he had a second store to the study built in so he could block out the noise. And the study that he wrote inside, it needed to be meticulously arranged as well. He needed the desk in front of the window. He needed goose quill pens, very fancy, blue ink as well to write with. On the desk there needed to be a vase of fresh flowers, 2 bronze statues on there as well. One was of a toad and the other were of some dogs. And his routine was strict as well. He rose at 7 o'clock, at 8 he had breakfast, and at 9, bam, there he was in his study with his blue goose quill pen writing. At 2 o'clock he finished his work for the day, on paper that is, because he took a 3-hour walk around London to think about his work and to come up with ideas. I wonder how far he got on that journey around town. I mean, today it would take you about 3 hours just to weave through the tourists on Regent Street. On his walk, he was pondering his tale, and he was searching for pictures to write with. And on returning, he was said to be revitalised, and he had the personification of energy. Brilliant phrase. He needed all that energy as well. On an ordinary day, he would write down 2,000 words easily, no issue. During a particularly bountiful time of imagination, in a frenzy, he could get 4,000 words done. But, I mean, no one's perfect, and it's always good to know when you're struggling writing that there would be days he would write nothing at all. It's always good to know, isn't it, that even the most accomplished writers in history, like Charles Dickens, occasionally had their off days. As always with Distinguished Diaries, I need to hand a massive thanks out to Mason Curry's brilliant book, Daily Rituals. If you've got any weird interest in this thing that I've decided to dedicate a whole podcast to, that is the book you need to get hold of. Right, it's back to part 2 of our writer's routine chat with the author Simon Toyne. He's one of the UK's most successful thriller writers. His debut novel, Sanctus, was published in so many different languages all over the world. We'll talk to him about that. We'll find out how he made sure that his stories would sell well, and also at what point he starts to know who the bad guys are. Here's what I'm now interested in is, so you've been to Rouen, you've seen the tall spindly spire of the cathedral, and then you've got your idea of how the first book ends. Now, what I found fascinating about the series is it hugely grows into something you don't think it's going to become. In the second book, there's so many ideas, religious ideas, that you don't really get is happening. So at what point are they creeping into your mind? What I guess I'm asking, in a very, very incongruous way, is, are you thinking of it book by book, or in a Harry Potter-esque way, do you know how the whole arc of stories 1, 2 and 3 are happening?
Well, when I was planning Sanctus, I had no deal. I didn't know anyone in publishing, and so I was just trying to write a really good thriller. So all of my thinking was it was going to be a self-contained book that when it finished, that was it. I wasn't sort of planning a series or a trilogy or anything. The central premise is, so at the start, where a guy climbs to the top of this monastery in the middle of this town called Rouen in southern Turkey. And it's a bit of a kind of religious theme park of a place now. It's got huge history, and there's all these rumours surrounding it, and particularly this place called the Citadel, which is this monastery in the centre of it that's built into this tower of rock, that it contains some sacrament, some relic upon which, a foundation, some magical thing upon which all of Western religion has been built. Anyway, so it starts off and a monk climbs to the top, makes a symbol of the cross with his body, and then falls to his death. And he falls in such a way that he just falls outside the jurisdiction of the monastery. And so the city police take over, and there's an autopsy. And in his body, they find that he swallowed some things, obviously clues. One of which is a strip of leather with some numbers etched on it, and initially they think they are verses from the Bible, but they suddenly realise actually it's much more simple than that. It's a phone number. So they dial the phone number and get through to a woman in America who's a journalist, who turns out to be the sister of this guy, this monk who fell to his death. And at that point, as a reader, you are going to find out what the sacrament is, and that was the engine of the book. It's like, here's a massive secret supposedly held in this place, no one knows what it is, or even if it exists. As a reader, you are going to find out what that thing is by the end of that book. So my problem with the first book was, once you do find out what that is right at the end of the book is over. Yeah. It's done. So the problem with the first book, when I did my first draft, was having to tie up all those loose ends very quickly once you find out what the sacrament is. So I did that, and the way I did it was a sort of epilogue that was 1 year later, and you see the Citadel, and you see the various people, and you can see that person didn't die and they're okay now, and you can kind of pay off a few things and say, well, we discovered this and this and this and whatever. And it kind of worked in terms of just wrapping up everything very quickly, but it was very unsatisfying in terms of the characters who were still around. When I eventually sold the book, my editor said two things. One, what do you want to write next? And two, we don't really like the ending. And so I was like, okay, well, I hadn't really thought about what to write next. And the ending, well, and that's when I said, oh, but I've, there were loads of other ideas that I didn't quite manage to fit into this, that are, expand the story of the citadel and the sacrament, all the people who are in there, and the ramifications of, once you've discovered what the sacrament is, how would that affect the rest of the world, and various things. And so in talking about it, I realised there was another book in it. And actually this epilogue of 1 year later, I could, rather than just doing an epilogue and jumping 1 year later, I could write a book that filled in that time. And then in the process of figuring out how to do that, I realised what I did was I wrote the outline of what turned into book 3. But I don't quite know how to get from the end of the book that I've just written to this new book. So then I started figuring it out, and this linking got longer and longer and longer, and then until that became a book. So then this 5 or 6 page epilogue of 1 year later, explain loads of stuff, turned into 2 whole books.
Religious thriller is a huge genre, and it's so famous now for people like Dan Brown. What did you feel about getting involved with your first book being in that genre when you put it out there?
Well,
were you at all nervous about getting involved in something that can be so controversial, and also so, although yours weren't, so critically hated?
Well, no, I mean, not really. I mean, the thing is that wherever you write, if you're writing anything, you inevitably there'll be some book that's gone before, and sometimes there's a whole bunch of books that have gone before, and they create their own little genre or subgenre. I came from commercial TV, so I wanted to write something commercial. I wanted to write something that would potentially pay the bills. So inevitably, the sensible thing to do in that instance is to look at something that's sold. And therefore books that people want to read and like to read, because the chances are if you write a good book in that same genre, they might want to read yours too. So I've never been scared of writing within the conventions of a genre. In some ways they're quite useful, because you just go, oh, here's a set of rules, these are the elements that this needs to include. So actually I understand those, and I can kind of write a little list and go, right, it's got that, and this has got, and hopefully it's got a really great and surprising plot in the middle of it.
So you are doing it that analytically, when you think, right, so I'm writing a thriller, I need short chapters, I need every single chapter to end that's going to make me, the reader, want to read to the next chapter. You're seriously thinking that thoroughly and then analysing how that works? Yeah,
totally. I remember I came from TV, and my last job in TV was I was a development exec. So I was coming up with new shows, but largely coming up with new shows and commercial shows as well, sort of shows that are going to be returnable series, something that's going to play in prime time, something that the advertisers are going to like. And a lot of that is looking at the shows that are working or shows that have worked before and pulling them apart and figuring out how they work. And forensically doing it as well, literally looking at something and going, right, where do the titles come in? How long are they? How long's that first part? How long's the longest scene? How many characters of stories have we got going at any one point? What the music's doing, whether it's minor key or major key, that level of detail of like what works. Because a lot of the time, the stuff, and if you pull things apart, I mean, look at cinema in particular. If you look at the way cinema works, everything's 3-act structure. It's like the first act that ends up to on a cliffhanger, goes up to another thing where there's a few plot twists. There's a central point where everything sort of, if it's been going up, it starts coming down. If it's been going down, it starts coming up. Then you have the break at the end of it, and then the big end part. And if you look at I'm quite obsessed with narrative structures. You could look at this stuff, and it goes back to Aristotle wrote, with his Poetics, he outlined how to write drama, and it's the 3-act structure. and he called it, I can't remember, something and catastrophe is the third act. And then you go through, and Hegel did the same and kind of called it, and there was 3 acts again, but he called it the same. And then you get through to sort of modern structure with Joseph Campbell famously did it. He looked at all of the fairy tales and all the great stories and worked out this monomyth. They all follow the same pattern, and then George Lucas and people like that were really into Joseph Campbell and created narratives based on the same thing. But again, if you look at it, it breaks down into the 3-act structure: beginning, middle, and end. Introduction, confrontation, resolution. There's this kind of slight toxic myth, I think, of writers that somehow you've just got to kind of be a prisoner to the muse, and that you've just got to write the best story possible, and if you're thinking commercially, then somehow you're not doing it properly, and somehow you've kind of sold out, whatever. It's like, why? Because as far as I'm concerned, I'm telling stories. When I wrote screenplays, I was telling stories. When I worked for 20 years in television, I was telling stories. Now I write books and I'm telling stories. And so to kind of figure out a story that loads of people are going to like is not necessarily selling out. It's about wanting to be really good storyteller. So no, I absolutely kind of went and tried to write a thriller in a genre that was popular at that time because of the Dan Brown books.
I want one last Sanctus question, if I may, and it's it's a bit of a spoiler one. So
spoiler.
So stop listening
if you haven't read the book.
Now, I'm not going to give too much of the details about it, because it's not really... It is a spoiler in that it's who the bad guy is. But for me, that wasn't the most interesting thing in what was going on. It was the huge themes, the huge cosmological themes that's happening in there. But basically, we find out in the end of the final book, The Tower, that the villain of the piece, Novus Sancti, is a geek called Merryweather. And it turns out that he is the first person who is mentioned. The very first word of the book is his name. How did that happen? Was that a case of you being surprised and then you reworking it? Or did you know that the whole way through?
No, that was me being surprised by the story. So I started off. So The Tower really it kind of takes the themes from the first book into... right up to the modern day. And so it starts off with a cyber attack on the Hubble Space Telescope, which is looking at the deepest, furthest known space, and lots of people think it's a heresy. They say that effectively what we're trying to do is look at beyond our known universe to gaze upon the face of God. The way I tied it in with a modern thriller is that there is a cyber attack on the space telescope. So rather than looking out to the farthest reaches of space, it turns around and looks down on Earth. So it's kind of it's looking not at God but at man. And the guy who happens to be on duty at the time when this thing happens is this cosmological geek who works at the Space Control Center.
He's like a 50s throwback, isn't he?
Yeah, and he wears knitted ties and he's buttoned down and wears horn-rimmed glasses, and then and his heroes are all the guys who did the Apollo missions and all this sort of stuff. And it turns out that they find this data that Hubble had seen, and it looks like a countdown. But there's all these theories, that it gets out that it's countdown to the end of times because we've looked upon the same, we've dared to look upon the face of God and their big heresy and all this sort of stuff. And all the way through, there's an idea of, so the Sanctus, which are this ancient order of monks that looked after the sacrament in the first book, have all been wiped out pretty much in the first 2 books. And so there's this new guy who's mentioned a couple of times, you see him performing the same rituals that they did, called the Novus Sanctus. So it's the new sancti, effectively, but you don't know who he is, and you all the way through you're thinking, could be this guy, and I kind of knew I needed this guy, but I didn't know who he was going to be.
At what point did you find out who it was?
I can't remember exactly, but I think I was about halfway through it, or maybe even 2/3 of the way through it, when it suddenly occurred to me who the perfect person to make this person would be. And also that thing of like how satisfying it would be if you see this guy right at the beginning and then he kind of pops up and you just totally forget, he's there literally on page 1. He's there, and but as you say, it's not the main mystery, really. I mean, there's all these other mysteries in it. That's one of them. But then, the revelation of who he is, it comes at the end, right, in this big kind of sort of like surprise moment when you see him, and you kind of, you realise who he is at the same time as the other people realise who he must be, and and then there's this scene going on where it's all very tense. No more spoilers, but so that was absolutely a moment where the story surprised me, and I just had that idea and thought, oh yeah, that's good. Writing books is not like a lot of other things in that you don't consciously get better at it. I think you do get better at it, but it's not conscious, because you struggle. Every book is a struggle. Every scene is a struggle. Every character is a struggle. You sort of, you get it wrong. Most of it is getting it wrong and making mistakes and then just finding a good bit and working on that. And so what I've come to terms with is, unlike, playing football or something like that, where you play the fitter you get and the more skills you have and you can tell. Writing is, when you write a book and finish a book, at the end of it, all you've really learned how to do is how to write that book. And so when you start a new book, all the bets are off. There are certain things you've got, like in terms of just natural pacing or character or dialogue or whatever, that you can improve at, but that's sort of details. Actually writing the book, you have to figure it out every single time. I don't think I could read any of my older stuff and look at it and just go, oh yeah, no, I can see what I was doing there and I'm better at that now or whatever. I'd just be looking at it wincing and just going, oh god, I'm sure I'd probably want to change everything. I think this is the Dorothy Parker saying, which is really good. She says, I can never write 5 words, but I have to change 7 of them. And I think that's writing. You constantly want to change it. So I've learned that, and I've come to terms with that, I think. Another thing I have learned about writing, having now done 5, is that there is always a point, roughly halfway through, around about the 50, 60,000 word mark, where you absolutely are convinced that the idea that you thought was good enough to be a book is the worst idea anyone's ever had, and you need to rewrite it all, and you should just stop, and you don't know what you were thinking, and you don't know how you're going to finish it, because you've got to write roughly the same amount that you've already written that all needs rewriting. And I've realised, not only through my own experience but talking to other writers, that happens every single time, and you just, again, that goes to the point of my own advice, is you just need to ignore it at that point and just keep writing, knowing, in the full knowledge that it's rubbish and no one will ever read it and it's terrible anyway, but just get to the end point, because then you can put it to one side and get drunk and do something else, and then print it out and then read it with sort of one eye closed, sort of preparing to wince, and discover that it's not that bad. Yes, it needs work, and it's waffly in some places and some stuff doesn't make sense, but it's not as bad as you thought it was 60,000 words in, when you thought it was the worst thing ever.
A massive thank you then to Simon Toyne for coming on The Writer's Routine. He's a very busy man, and he managed to find the time for this interview in between filming his CBS TV show Written in Blood and also writing a brand new book too. So yeah, that 6-month sabbatical to France has definitely paid off for him. The second in the Solomon Creed series as well is called The Boy Who Saw. It's brand new and you can pick it up right now. And thank you so much for listening. Remember, you can tweet in and give us a follow. We are at WritersPod. You can email us, writersroutine@gmail.com, and make sure you subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes, because we're back next week with an author who has written like an encyclopedia on gender equality. I promise it's completely different to anything you've read before. It's written by David DeVere, and we'll get his writing routine on next week's show. I will see you then. Goodbye.